Today we're taking a look at 3 stories that show the extent of how segregation and integration affected the lives of Black Americans.
We couldn't go to Springdale and be there up there after dark. We couldn't go to Bentonville. I think all those little towns were still kind of, they weren't ready for us.
From examining the risks of traveling to taking a look at how segregation affected the way Black parents were forced to raise their children.
I remember the fairgrounds when my children were small. They would ask me why they could not go. I said, baby, one day you'll be able to go.
We'll hear a story of what it was like growing up and attending a segregated school.
Then I'm starting to realize why the deprivations, why are we deprived of certain things. And the word racism wasn't mentioned. That was, just that's the way white people are. This is the way we are. And make the best of it.
When Joseph Powdrell was a child in Texas, schools had yet to be integrated. Now he's a resident of Albuquerque, New Mexico. In this story, he reflects on what life was like during that time and what parallels he sees between the civil rights movement and the Black Lives Matter movement.
I always wanted to experience things like microscopes and stuff like that. We had none of that. We simply had a classroom, paper, and none of that. And that's when I started to feel like, we're missing something here. There was a white high school right down the street from us. They had everything. Biology labs, they did everything. And then I'm starting to wonder, why do they have that and we have that?
Joseph Powdrell grew up in Crosbyton, Texas. This pamphlet from the time calls it a progressive and forward-looking town. This image says there's a place for you. But to Powdrell, who attended a segregated elementary school, it didn't always feel that way.
Then I'm starting to realize why the deprivations, why are we deprived of certain things. And the word racism wasn't mentioned. That was, just that's the way white people are. This is the way we are. Make the best of it.
So it wasn't viewed as racism?
No.
It was just 2 different life experiences?
Yeah. This is suitable for you. This is suitable for us.
So what was it like for you, having seen the civil rights movement play out during your own lifetime, to then also see another movement? When we saw the protests that took place last summer, George Floyd protest, in Albuquerque and nationwide, what did you think about that, and how did that compare to the marches of the 1960s?
Those movements in the 60s were, I won't say they were much more violent. They appeared to be violent because the world didn't want that. America didn't want that kind of visible reaction to what's been wrong. We're going to work it out, don't worry about it.
Did you think the George Floyd protests were similar, or were they different?
I think similar in the issue was the same. That kind of brutality. I've seen that. George Floyd, he was like another one.
As the fight for justice and equality continues,
Together we are more. I would say to your generation, when life is all said and done, what you think about yourself is going to be the bottom line. You be who you want to be. You be who you want to be.
In our next story, we'll hear from Vernice Wheeler, who was born and raised in Birmingham, Alabama. She worked as a nurse for 15 years during segregation and explains what life was like for her both personally and professionally.
They hung nooses for him because he was a real fighter for civil rights. One time when the children were small, I don't think they even remember, but we had threats on our home because of segregation. And at one time, they had to kind of watch our house because we got bomb threats.
Did you make it your purpose to get your children involved in that?
Yes.
And can you tell me why?
Because I knew somehow things would change one day, and we would always encourage them to strive for the stars. I remember the fairgrounds when my children were small. They would ask me why they could not go. I said, baby, one day you'll be able to go. The fairground was they would have fairs, and blacks could only go certain nights.
When your kids would ask you questions about, why can't we go? How did that make you feel as a mother?
I explained to them that hopefully one day they will be able to go, but blacks just wasn't allowed to go until certain days. but I had a lot of explaining to do.
Tell me about your career path there. How hard was it for you?
It was hard because when we first started in nursing, blacks wasn't allowed to give medications. We just had to do the other work. But later on, after segregation was, they was working on it still. But after that, we were able to give medications.
What are some things you see today that you never thought you would see in Birmingham?
I never thought we'd see a black mayor. I never thought we'd see black city councils, black commissioners, black principals in schools. It's better now. It's much better than it was in those days because they really had to fight.
Did you ever see the images of the Black Lives Matter protests after George Floyd was killed? Have you ever compared those same images to what was broadcasted then during the Martin Luther King rallies and the sit-downs?
Yes, I do compare with that, but it's even in those days, which been a long time ago, it just wasn't like that. It wasn't as many people protesting.
Can you give some positive energy, some positive feedback to people who are still fighting like those who did back in the Martin Luther King days?
Keep your chin up. Things are getting better, and I would always advise them, like I told my children, to reach for the stars and always strive for higher. Like first time we have a black vice president, and they could do that too.
In our last story, meet Virginia Smith Denton, one of the first black students to attend Fayetteville High School in Arkansas. She sat down to tell her story of what it was like to desegregate that school in the fall of 1954.
We weren't scared, but we were a little nervous.
On the first day of school in September of 1954, Virginia remembers walking to Fayetteville High with her cousins Roberta and Elnora Lackey. It was her first year in high school and one that would make history. That year, 7 black students would join more than 500 white students, learning together for the very first time. When they arrived, they were not greeted by an angry mob, police, or weapons. Waiting for them at the entrance were Mary Ann Sharp and Sarah Traeger, 2 white classmates Virginia would later call her friends.
We saw them standing out there. We didn't know what to think, but they were so nice, and they, told us, welcomed us.
It was a very different scene than some others playing out in the Deep South. Virginia says inside the classroom at Fayetteville High School, her teachers were welcoming.
They were nice too, yes. They were. Well, except for one. I didn't like her. She didn't like me either, but.
What do you remember about the students at Fayetteville High, your classmates?
I think it was in history class, yeah. We had this one guy that got told this little in joke, but he got suspended.
He was suspended for saying
yes,
that?
Yes. But he got to come back, but he got suspended for a while. So they weren't taking any, you know what? They wasn't going to start taking no stuff like that.
But outside of Fayetteville High, Virginia says the students faced a different reality. She says they avoided going to several nearby cities and towns after dark.
We couldn't go to Springdale and be there up there after dark. We couldn't go to Bentonville. I think all those little towns were still kind of, they weren't ready for us. But now we can go wherever we want. We couldn't be there after Sunday.
What would happen if somebody of color was there?
Well, they probably might have shot them. You couldn't be up there after dark. Yeah, but we went through there. Still, we just didn't stop, in any of the stores, because we've gone there to go, like to Tulsa and stuff, but yeah, you just couldn't stop. It was kind of bad back in there. We couldn't go to Farmington. Well, it was terrible.
Nearly 70 years later, Virginia still calls Fayetteville home. Her kids and grandkids, also graduates of Fayetteville High School. Soon, her great-grandkids will be too. Virginia says Northwest Arkansas is not the same community it was in 1954, but there is still more work that needs to be done.
Some things have changed. I just hope everybody can be as one. I mean, we're all God's children. I think that would be a good thing.
These three individuals all made history through different trying circumstances in hopes that future generations would be able to live life differently. Their stories of the past remind us to keep pushing towards change in the future. Thanks for watching. For more stories like these, click the subscribe button.